Sometimes the most unexpected moments don't begin with noise. They begin with normalcy. No crowd holding its breath. No dramatic music swelling in the background. Just a familiar environment where nothing seems out of place. In the action world, certain names carry weight without effort. Not because they demand attention, but because attention naturally follows them. When people like that exist in the same space, something subtle happens. The room feels different, even if no one can quite explain why. This wasn't a showdown. Not at first. It was one of those moments that could have passed unnoticed if you weren't paying attention. A shared space. A routine setting. The kind of situation where everyone assumes nothing memorable will happen. And that assumption is exactly what makes what comes next so powerful. What's important here isn't who spoke first or who was watching. It's the energy of the moment. The unspoken awareness that two very different approaches to strength were about to occupy the same frame. One built on movement, speed, and intensity. The other shaped by stillness, patience, and years of quiet confidence. At this stage, nothing feels confrontational. There's no tension yet, just contrast. And contrast is where stories really begin. People often think challenges announce themselves loudly. They don't. More often, they arrive wrapped in casual behavior. A look held a second too long, a tone that lands differently than intended, a moment that feels heavier than it should. The viewer isn't being told to take sides here. There's no judgment being passed, just an invitation to observe. Because the truth is, moments like this happen all the time, not just between famous figures, but in everyday life. In workplaces, in social settings, in rooms where ego and restraint quietly measure each other without a word being spoken. That's why this moment matters. Not because of what it turns into, but because of what it could have become. At this point, everything is still balanced. Nothing has tipped yet. The story is standing at the edge, giving you just enough time to lean in before anything shifts. And that's where we pause. Right before intention is interpreted. Right before calm is tested. Right before the situation stops being ordinary. Because once that line is crossed, even subtly, there's no going back to how it started. Nothing changes all at once. That's what makes moments like this easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Up until now, everything still looks ordinary on the surface. The setting hasn't shifted. The atmosphere hasn't exploded into conflict. People around them continue doing what they were doing before. But something does change. It's subtle enough that you could explain it away if you wanted to. A pause that lasts a fraction longer than expected. A look that doesn't break when it normally would. A presence that quietly asks a question without ever forming one out loud. This is where the challenge begins. Not with words, not with action, but with interpretation. One person does something completely reasonable, completely harmless, the kind of thing that wouldn't register in most situations. But in this moment, it lands differently, and that difference matters. The challenge isn't announced. It's felt, not by everyone, just by the people who understand the language of dominance, reputation, and unspoken hierarchy. The kind of language that isn't taught, but learned through experience. At this stage, nothing aggressive has happened. No boundaries have been crossed. And that's exactly why the moment is dangerous. Because when a challenge is obvious, it can be addressed openly. When it's subtle, it forces interpretation. And interpretation is where ego steps in. One side could ignore it completely, brush it off as nothing, pretend it never happened. But the other side notices. And once something is noticed, it can't be unseen. This is where the tension starts to build, not outwardly, but internally. A mental calculation begins. Was that intentional? Was it casual? Was it confidence? Or was it testing the room? No one asks these questions out loud. They don't need to, because the real challenge isn't about proving anything to others. It's about deciding how to respond to the moment within yourself. And this is where people reveal who they are. Some respond quickly. They assert. They clarify. They push back. Others don't respond at all, at least not in the way people expect. And that silence? That's where the tension sharpens. Because silence forces everyone else to fill in the meaning. The air changes just slightly. Not enough for casual observers to notice, but enough for those tuned into it to feel the shift. The moment stretches. Still nothing dramatic happens. And yet, it's clear now that this isn't just a neutral interaction anymore. The challenge has landed. What makes this moment compelling isn't the possibility of conflict. It's the uncertainty of direction. This could escalate. It could dissolve. It could transform into something else entirely. And no one knows which way it will go yet. That uncertainty pulls the viewer in. Because at some point in their own life, they've been here too. In a meeting. In a conversation. In a social setting where something fell off but couldn't be easily explained. That's why this part of the story works. It mirrors real human experience. Challenges in real life rarely come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. They come disguised as normal behavior, just slightly misaligned with the moment. And the strongest reactions aren't always physical or verbal. Sometimes they're measured in restraint. Here, the situation hasn't crossed into conflict, but it's no longer neutral either. It exists in a narrow space between intention and perception. And that space is uncomfortable. Because now, every movement matters more. Every pause is noticed. Every response, or lack of one, is interpreted. The viewer begins to lean in without realizing it. Not because they expect action, but because they're waiting for meaning. What does this moment say about confidence? About control? About how power actually works when no one is performing for an audience? This is the quiet pressure point of the story. And it's important that nothing explodes here. If it did, the moment would lose its depth. Instead, the tension stays contained, compressed, waiting. The challenge remains unresolved, and that's intentional. Because the real impact doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from how the moment is handled. And that handling hasn't happened yet. At this stage, the viewer senses that whatever comes next will redefine everything that came before it. The commentary now feels like preparation. The subtle disruption feels like a test. And the story hasn't even reached its turning point. We pause here, not because the moment is over, but because the weight of it has finally become visible. Right before response, right before restraint proves its value, right before the meaning of the challenge becomes clear. Up until now, everything has been balanced on a thin line. Nothing has crossed into open conflict. No one has raised their voice. No move has been made that forces a response. But something important has changed. The moment is no longer neutral. What began as subtle tension has now turned inward into perception. And perception is where escalation truly begins. Because escalation doesn't always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like awareness. Both sides are now aware that something is being measured. Not strength, not status, but composure. This is the point where many situations break one way or another. Not because of what happens, but because of how people interpret what's already happened. The challenge hasn't grown louder. It's grown heavier. Every second that passes without resolution adds pressure. Not external pressure, internal. This is where expectations start doing the work. People expect a response. They expect movement. They expect something that confirms what they already believe about confidence and power. And when that expectation isn't met, the tension increases. Because now the silence feels intentional. What once could have been dismissed now feels deliberate. The lack of reaction becomes the reaction. And that's when perception reframes the entire situation. What looked like hesitation a moment ago starts to feel like control. What might have seemed passive now feels calculated. This is the turning point. Not because anything new is introduced, but because everything that came before is suddenly seen differently. The viewer begins to reassess their own assumptions. Was the challenge meant to provoke? Or was it meant to test restraint? Was the calm presence a sign of disengagement or absolute confidence? The story doesn't answer these questions outright. It lets them sit. And sitting with uncertainty is uncomfortable. That discomfort is what keeps attention locked in. Because escalation through perception pulls the viewer into the moment mentally. They're no longer watching from the outside. They're participating internally. They're running scenarios, imagining responses, projecting how they might act in the same position. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because everyone has been here. In a meeting where someone subtly tests authority. In a conversation where a pause carries more weight than words. In a moment where reacting would feel easy, but restraining yourself would feel powerful. This is the exact point where ego and discipline quietly negotiate. React, and you risk proving something unnecessary. Stay calm, and you risk being misunderstood. There's no obvious right answer, and that's why the moment works. The escalation now exists entirely in interpretation. No one watching can agree on what the correct response should be, and that division is intentional. Because the story isn't about what should happen. It's about what confidence actually looks like when it's not being performed. This is where the audience pauses mentally. And this is where the engagement question belongs. Not at the peak of action, but at the peak of meaning. Do you think real confidence shows itself through action or through restraint? Once that question enters the viewer's mind, the story changes shape. They're no longer waiting for something dramatic to happen. They're waiting to see which philosophy wins. Action or restraint. Projection or presence. Noise or silence. The escalation now feels heavier because it's no longer about two individuals. It's about a principle. And principles don't resolve quickly. The moment stretches further, not outward but inward. The energy tightens. At this stage, even small movements feel significant. A shift in posture. A change in attention. A moment of stillness held just long enough to make others uncomfortable. This is where power quietly reveals itself, not by taking space, but by owning it. And the audience can feel it. They sense that whatever happens next will define the meaning of everything that came before. Not because it will be loud, but because it will be decisive. The turning point isn't marked by impact. It's marked by understanding. By now, the viewer realizes that the challenge itself was never the point. The response to it is. And that response is coming, but not yet. Because the story wants you to sit with the question a little longer. To test your own instincts. To notice what you expect to happen, and why. This is escalation at its most effective. No explosion. No spectacle. Just perception sharpening into clarity. And once that clarity arrives, nothing that follows can be interpreted the same way again. The moment doesn't resolve itself with movement. It resolves itself with stillness. After everything that has been measured, interpreted, and silently weighed, the response finally arrives, not as an action, but as a choice. And that choice is restraint. There's no announcement, no visible signal that something has shifted, but everyone who's paying attention feels it immediately. The energy in the space changes, not because something happened, but because something didn't. The expected reaction never comes. And that absence does more than any confrontation ever could. Silence, in this moment, isn't empty. It's deliberate. It's controlled. It communicates without explaining itself. What once felt like a challenge now feels suspended, as if it no longer has anywhere to land. This is where the power shifts. Not because one side dominates the other, but because the entire frame of the situation changes. The person who issued the challenge, subtly or otherwise, is now forced to sit with it alone. Without resistance to push against, the tension collapses inward. And that's uncomfortable, because challenges rely on response. They need engagement to stay alive. When there is none, the challenge loses its shape. What's remarkable here is how quickly perception flips. The silence that might have been mistaken for uncertainty now reads as confidence. The calm that could have been misinterpreted as hesitation now feels unshakable. Nothing about the posture changes dramatically. Nothing about the expression demands attention. And yet, attention gathers anyway. This is the kind of authority that doesn't ask to be recognized. It simply is. The power shift isn't loud enough for everyone to notice. But those who do notice understand it immediately. They realize the moment has passed. Not ended, passed. The challenge has already been answered without words. And now, the dynamic is different. What once felt like tension now feels resolved, even though nothing has technically been resolved yet. The pressure drains from the room. People resume their movements. Conversations find their rhythm again. But something permanent has been established beneath the surface. This is where the story deepens. Because the response wasn't about winning. It wasn't about asserting dominance. It wasn't about proving anything at all. It was about refusing to let the moment dictate behavior. That kind of restraint reframes the entire interaction. It suggests experience. It suggests self-awareness. It suggests confidence that doesn't need validation. And that realization lands slowly, but firmly. This is the exact point where the viewer begins to reflect on their own experiences. Moments when reacting would have felt satisfying. Moments when staying calm felt difficult, but ultimately more effective. Moments where silence changed the outcome without anyone fully understanding how. And this is where the engagement question belongs, not at the height of tension, but at the moment of understanding. Have you ever seen a situation where staying calm was more powerful than proving a point? Once that question enters the mind, the power shift becomes personal. The viewer isn't just watching anymore. They're remembering. They're revisiting situations where they reacted too quickly, or moments where restraint changed how others perceive them. The story now operates on two levels at once. What's happening on screen and what's happening internally. That's the real shift. Because the silence didn't just reshape the moment. It redefined the meaning of strength. Strength here isn't measured in dominance. It's measured in discipline. Not in how much space someone takes up, but in how little they need to. The calm response closes the door on escalation without slamming it. It leaves no damage behind. No aftermath to clean up. Just clarity. By now, it's clear that whatever comes next won't involve confrontation. The moment has already said everything it needed to say, and the audience understands that the most powerful response has already happened. Without sound, without spectacle, without explanation. This is the kind of power shift that doesn't demand agreement. It invites respect. And once that respect settles in, there's nothing left to challenge. Nothing is announced. There's no verbal acknowledgement. No gesture meant to signal victory. No closing statement that explains what just happened. And yet, recognition settles in. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, through changed behavior, through softened posture, through the way attention subtly shifts without anyone directing it. This is recognition without declaration. No one says the moment mattered, but everyone behaves as if it did. The most striking thing is how ordinary everything looks again. People return to what they were doing. The setting resumes its original rhythm, but the meaning of the space has changed. Moments like this don't end with a clear line. They fade, and that fading is intentional. Because when recognition is real, it doesn't need to be stated. Those who witnessed it understand what occurred. Those who didn't never quite know why the atmosphere feels different. And that difference lingers. What's powerful here isn't admiration or submission. It's adjustment, subtle recalibration. The challenge is no longer active. Not because it was defeated, but because it no longer feels necessary. That's the outcome. The silence that once carried tension now carries understanding. The calm that once felt ambiguous now feels definitive. This is how unspoken respect forms. Not through spectacle, not through performance, but through behavior aligning itself around quiet authority. What's especially interesting is how nothing needs to be defended afterward. There's no explanation, no justification. The moment stands on its own, complete, even though it was never officially resolved. And this is where the story widens beyond the scene itself. Because recognition without declaration doesn't just happen in isolated moments. It happens in boardrooms, in leadership, in public life. People adjust their expectations based on what they observe, not what they're told. And once that adjustment happens, it rarely reverses. The viewer now understands something important. Reputation isn't built only through action. It's shaped through restraint, consistency, and how pressure is handled when no one is narrating the moment. This realization invites reflection. Public figures are often defined by labels, by roles, by past performances. But moments like this introduce a quiet disruption. They suggest that what we think we know may not be complete. That a single, unguarded interaction can reveal more than years of curated appearances. And this is where the engagement question belongs. Not at the end of action, but at the beginning of interpretation. Do moments like this change how you view public figures, or do reputations stay fixed for you? Once that question enters the mind, the implied outcome becomes personal. The viewer begins to reconsider their own assumptions. Have they ever revised their opinion of someone after seeing how they handled pressure quietly? Or do first impressions and public narratives carry more weight than subtle behavior? There's no right answer here, and the story doesn't push one. It simply offers the moment as evidence and steps back. Because recognition without declaration doesn't demand agreement. It allows interpretation. That's why it's powerful. The outcome doesn't need to be spoken because it's already been absorbed. By now, the viewer understands that nothing dramatic was required for the shift to occur. No confrontation, no dominance, no closing statement, just presence, maintained long enough for meaning to crystallize. This is how certain figures gain quiet credibility, not through control of the narrative, but through moments that resist narration altogether. And once that credibility forms, it doesn't announce itself. It shows up later, in how others listen, in how they respond, in how they no longer test what doesn't need testing. The story concludes without declaring a winner, because the real outcome wasn't about winning. It was about how the moment reorganized perception, and how that reorganization happened without permission, without explanation, and without spectacle. Recognition has occurred. No one said it out loud. No one needed to, and that's why it lasts. After the moment passes, nothing looks different at first. There's no aftermath in the traditional sense. No raised voices echoing afterward. No replay-worthy moment people rush to describe. And yet the impact continues. It shows up later, in memory, in interpretation, in the way the moment quietly returns when you least expect it. This is the kind of aftermath that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It waits. Because moments without action don't compete with noise. They settle deeper. Long after the scene has ended, the mind keeps revisiting it. Not to replay what happened, but to understand why it mattered. The viewer realizes that the absence of drama created space for meaning. Without spectacle to distract, the moment became reflective instead of reactive. And that's where its wider impact begins. People carry moments like this into other situations, into conversations, into decisions. They become reference points, not for what to do, but for how to be. The story stops being about public figures or reputation. It becomes about behavior under pressure, about how restraint can shape outcomes long after the moment itself disappears. This is where reframing occurs. What once might have seemed uneventful now feels significant. What lacked action now feels intentional. The viewer begins to understand that some moments stay with us because they resist closure. They don't tell us what to think. They invite us to keep thinking. That invitation lingers. And this is where the narrative widens beyond the individuals involved. Moments like this influence how we judge leadership, how we define strength, how we interpret silence. They challenge the idea that impact requires visibility. Instead, they suggest that the most formative experiences are often the quietest ones, the ones that don't rush to explain themselves. The mind keeps circling back because it senses unfinished meaning. Not unfinished in a frustrating way, unfinished in a thoughtful one. And that's powerful. The viewer begins to connect this moment to others in their own life. Times when restraint altered the direction of an interaction. Times when choosing not to act carried more weight than acting ever could. This is how the story extends its reach. It's no longer confined to one place or time. It becomes a lens, a way of seeing moments that might otherwise be dismissed. And this is exactly where the engagement question belongs. Not at the peak of emotion, but at the depth of understanding. Why do you think some moments without action stay with us longer than dramatic ones? Once that question enters the viewer's mind, the reframing completes itself. They begin to realize that drama often resolves itself quickly. It burns bright, and then it's gone. But restraint creates residue. It leaves behind questions instead of answers, impressions instead of conclusions. And impressions are harder to forget. The aftermath of a quiet moment doesn't fade, it integrates. It becomes part of how we recognize confidence, maturity, and authority. This is why these moments feel larger than they appear. They don't dominate attention. They influence perspective. By now, the viewer understands that the wider impact wasn't immediate. It wasn't visible. It was internal. And internal shifts are the ones that last. The story doesn't end with a lesson spelled out. It ends with an awareness that sometimes the most powerful thing a moment can do is stay with us, quietly, persistently, long after the scene itself has passed. And that's the kind of impact no dramatic moment can easily replace. The moment doesn't conclude in any traditional sense. There's no final image meant to signal completion. No statement that neatly wraps everything up. No clear lines separating before and after. Instead, the story softens. It loosens its grip and allows the meaning to drift outward, not away, but into the viewer. This is how moments with a lingering effect operate. They don't demand to be remembered. They simply are remembered. Long after the scene has faded, something about it remains unsettled, not in a troubling way, but in a thoughtful one. It leaves space. Space for interpretation. Space for reflection. Space for the viewer to carry the moment forward without being told what to do with it. The absence of action now feels deliberate rather than incomplete. What once might have seemed restrained now feels resolved, just not finalized. This is the open resolution. The viewer realizes that the moment didn't end because it was meant to continue in a different form. Not on screen, but in memory. That's why it lingers. The mind keeps returning to it, not to search for missing pieces, but to sit with what was already there. Nothing else needed to happen. And that realization is surprisingly satisfying. Because open endings trust the audience. They assume awareness. They allow intelligence to do the final work. This is where the story releases control. Instead of directing attention, it invites contemplation. The viewer starts to notice how rare that is. Most stories rush to explain, to resolve, to instruct. This one doesn't. It simply offers the moment as it was, calm, unresolved, quietly complete. And because of that, it remains active long after it's over. The lingering effect isn't created by intensity. It's created by restraint. By resisting the urge to underline meaning, the moment allows meaning to deepen naturally. This is why moments like this resurface later, unexpectedly, during conversations, during quiet pauses, during times when composure matters more than reaction. They become internal reference points, not as lessons, but as reminders that not all influence announces itself, that not all strength needs expression, that not all resolution needs closure. And now, at this final stage, the engagement question emerges, not to provoke debate, but to extend the story beyond itself. Why do you think some moments without action stay with us longer than dramatic ones? Once that question enters the viewer's mind, the story fully opens. There's no expectation of an answer, only awareness. The viewer begins to recognize moments in their own life that operated the same way. Moments that didn't make sense immediately. Moments that felt small at the time, but grew larger in memory. The story's resolution now lives entirely in reflection. It doesn't settle into a conclusion. It settles into perspective. And perspective doesn't end. It evolves. This is what makes the lingering effect powerful. It respects the viewer's intelligence. It trusts their experience. The moment no longer belongs to the scene. It belongs to the viewer. And that's where the story quietly releases them. Not with a statement, not with a verdict, but with a thought that continues moving long after the final frame fades.